Who can win this ultimate showdown of ultimate destiny? It's Deconverted Man versus William Lane Craig.
Alright, it's intro time again. I've got nothing this time. Here we go.
Bad objection number 4. The first premise is based upon the fallacy of composition. It fallaciously infers that because everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause. Response to number 4. In order to understand this objection, we need to understand the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy of reasoning that because every part of a thing has a certain property, therefore the whole thing has that same property. Now, while wholes do sometimes possess the properties of their parts, for example, a fence, every picket of which is green, is also green, this is not always the case. For example, every little part of an elephant may be light in weight, but that does not imply that the whole elephant is light in weight. Now, I have never argued that because every part of the universe has a cause, therefore the whole universe has a cause. That would be manifestly fallacious.
But the original argumentation says everything that begins to exist has a cause. Everything being anything inside the universe. I'm not sure if we can speak about things outside of the universe, but that certainly would be all the component parts of the universe. So, yes, it is the fallacy of composition, that all the different parts do this, therefore the whole does that. Oh, wait, but I'm sorry, I forgot. That's not your real argument. Your real argument is just that whatever begins to exist has an efficient cause. So, your real argument does avoid the fallacy of composition, as long as the universe itself doesn't have an efficient cause, which it does according to you. So, your original argument is containing the composition fallacy. Whoops.
Rather, the reasons I've offered for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause are these. Number 1, something cannot come from nothing.
This is an extremely important point that I'm going to bring up again. We have to keep Craig to this point. Later on, there is no room for something to come from nothing. This is the way it is from now on. That is his rule that we're going to make him stick to in his side of the debate. On my side of the debate, I object to this because we have no example of nothing. To make this easier, instead of calling it nothing, I'm going to call it N. We do not have an example of N to know what the properties are of N, or what the properties are not of N. It would be like me saying, okay, we can get gold from a leprechaun, and we can't get gold unless we have a leprechaun. Well, we don't have an example of a leprechaun, so we don't know whether we can get gold from it or not because we have no example of it. Oh, how can you explain gold without the leprechaun? You have to have a leprechaun to have gold, but you have no example of a leprechaun, so you can't put that forward as an argumentation unless and until you have an example of it. We have no example of leprechaun. We have no example of N/nothing.
And now for That Could Have Been Said by an Atheist!
To claim that something can come into being out of nothing is worse than magic.
He waited his whole darn life just to take that flight, and as the plane crashed down, he thought, well, isn't this nice? And isn't it ironic, don't you think? Just a little ironic. And it's like WLC saying something like this on a rainy day or something. I don't know. I'm mangling Alanis Morissette, who should be mentioned because she was God in a movie once. So, it's related, sort of. Back to the analysis.
When a magician pulls a rabbit out of the hat, At least you've got the magician.
Okay, so God, being the magician, is a substitute for, then the rabbit is the universe. But what would the hat? The hat would be the universe, and both the universe, the hat, rabbit, the hat and the rabbit have to exist. The magician isn't making them come out of nothing, which you already established can't happen. So even if you have a magician that can do magic, that you said it's oh, never mind.
But if you deny premise 1, you've got to think that the whole universe just appeared at some point in the past for no reason whatsoever.
This is nothing more than a false choice, false dichotomy. To assert that I or anyone else must accept the flip side of something cannot come from nothing, which would be something can come from nothing, is to present the false dichotomy. Just because I reject one doesn't mean that I accept its opposite. I would also object and reject its opposite. I would object to it and reject it because we have no example of nothing, or as I was calling it earlier, N. Unless and until we have an example of N, I can't say anything about it at all. I can't say something can come from it. I can't say something cannot come from it.
But nobody sincerely believes that things, say a horse or an Eskimo village, can just pop into being without a cause.
This is an argument to analogy. Now, that's not always fallacious. I made an argument to analogy earlier in this video. If it's a false analogy, then it becomes fallacious. So, examining my own argument to analogy, is it a false one? As I said earlier, a leprechaun is something we don't have an example of, and nothingness is something we don't have an example of. Yes, a leprechaun is nothing like nothingness, at least as far as we know. But the concept of a leprechaun and the concept of nothing are very different. But they're both similar in the sense that we don't have an example of them. That's where the analogy begins and ends. Here we have an Eskimo and a horse coming out of something that we don't have an example of, which in this case is nothing, or as I'm calling it, N. And then we have the universe, which is very different from a horse or an Eskimo, also potentially coming out of N. We don't know if it can or can't, but that's the analogy. In the very beginning stages of the beginning of the universe, you have very small particles, and the small world works differently than the big world. The quantum world is extraordinarily different and obeys different rules than the big world. So you're talking about that small stuff not being able to come from something that you don't have an example of. But it might be that the quantum realm can come into existence from N, and in fact does come from N all the time. And once you have the quantum there, you no longer have N, because you've now filled the void where N once was with quantum particles, and then those particles react against each other, and then other things happen because of that. Okay, so we do not have an example of N here on Earth where an Eskimo or horse or whatever will just pop into being just because. So the analogy just completely and utterly falls apart as a false one.
2, if something can come into being from nothing, it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing.
This is nothing more than a false dichotomy again, so it's going to get the +1 for that. Here's the thing, we don't have an example of nothing, but I want to go deeper. If Craig and I are standing right next to each other on an open road with just nothing else around us, just a road with gravel, and that's it. Behind us is miles of road, in front of us miles of road, and we're just standing there. I don't know why. We had a debate. We finished our debate. We're just walking down this road, I guess. Whatever. And all of a sudden, a horse appears in front of us. Okay. That's all we know. We don't know anything else. The horse just, bing! There it is. Does that ruin Craig's argument? I go like, hey, Craig, a horse just appeared into being from nothing. And Craig could say, no, God created that horse just to prove that he exists for you. Why a horse, I don't know, but that's what happened. God did it. Now, I'm not going to assert what I just pretended to assert in this little thought experiment, but I could, and it should ruin his idea, because as far as we are concerned, the horse appeared out of nowhere. Now, it could be that God made it appear out of something, from somewhere, teleported it, created it on the spot, who knows. But let's just say that we said, you know what, we don't know what's going on. Both Craig and I are like, well, bleep, how did that happen? We bring in the scientists, we bring in the equipment, we examine that area, and we find this little tiny packet of nothing. And we have made a breakthrough in science. We have discovered nothingness. And Craig could say, well, God did the nothingness. Now, he would have to change his arguments. Well, things can come into existence from nothing, as science established on that day that Deconverted Man and I were walking down that road, and we both won a joint Nobel Prize for helping to discover it, blah, blah, blah. But he would have to change his argument. His argument would effectively have to change, right? But he could still insert God into that equation. The bottom line is nothingness is not something that we have encountered. I think that nothingness would be displaced by something. That once you had something, you would no longer have nothing. But I could be wrong. Nothing might be all around us all the time. Maybe that's how nothing is. I have no idea. I don't know how it works or doesn't work. No idea at all. So, my question is, how can we make an argument about something that we have no example of? How can we do it? We can't do it. But this is, again, it's just a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. It's expounding upon the original false dichotomy by saying you have to accept this. If you deny one, you must accept the opposite. It's simply not true. You don't have to accept the opposite. We don't know. Maybe it is the case that the universe is the only thing that ever came out of nothing, and nothing else will ever come out of nothing except for the universe. And maybe other universes are coming out of nothing, other places, because that's just how it works. I don't know. But how is that different from God doing it? If we can't identify the difference between a horse coming into being from nothing and a horse coming into being because God did it, then how does it help us to have this choice between the two? At least from our human perspective. If God is identical to nature or the bizarre, then how does asserting God help us to establish anything at all? I don't know the answer to that either, but it seems to me that we do not have the answer. The answer is not nothing. The answer is not God. We don't know what the answer is, but both of these things are something that we have to be skeptical of, and we don't have to accept either one as being the answer. We don't know enough about the situation to assert an answer at this point.
Think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer come into being out of nothing? Why is it only universes that can pop into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory?
I don't know. Nobody knows. You don't know. You have no example of nothing. Stop it.
There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness doesn't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothingness, since there isn't anything to be constrained.
This isn't an argument. It's more assertions without anything behind them. You don't know what the properties of nothing are or are not. You're just asserting how it works. You have no idea how it works or if it works at all or even exists. You don't know. I mean, it's worse than lobsters. At least when you have lobsters, you have the lobster, and the lobster pulls the lobster out of the lobster. But in this case, you don't even have the lobster. That's really bad, because at least lobsters exist. Whatever, back to the analysis.
Number 3, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is constantly verified and never falsified. It's hard to understand how any atheist committed to modern science could deny that premise 1 is more plausibly true than false in light of the evidence.
So premise 3 here is that common experience, which is irrelevant, so that's out the window, and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Well, common experience, relevant. Scientific evidence, nope, doesn't confirm the premise 1. Why? Because we do not have nothing to test or observe. So, outright lie and irrelevant.
Now, note well that the third reason is an appeal to inductive reasoning, not reasoning by composition. It's drawing an inductive inference about all the members of a class of things based on a sample of the class. Inductive reasoning undergirds all of science and is not to be confused with reasoning by composition, which is a fallacy. So, this objection is simply aimed at a straw man of the objector's own construction.
Well, Craig, that would be a great defense if only you didn't have all these logical fallacies in front of it. Because you do, we have to be skeptical of your conclusion in this case, which is that the original objection that you said was invalid is invalid and that it's a straw man. I think that it does commit the fallacy of compositional error for the reasons I explained earlier in this video, that if you have everything and everything is part of the universe and that's pieces of the whole, then I don't see how that is avoiding the compositional thing. Then you say, oh, well, the third thing where science is saying that stuff doesn't come out of nothing, but that's not what science is saying. Science says stuff comes from stuff. We don't know if something can come from nothing. We don't have an example of nothing to talk about. So it dissolves and melts at that point, and we have to be skeptical of your conclusions. And unless and until we have a logically coherent argument, we have to continue to be skeptical of those conclusions. Alright, that's it for part 4. Thank you for listening and posting your comments. And I don't have a question for you this time because nobody answered my question last time. So, anyways, here's some bloopers. And Craig's concept of nothing, or the philosophical concept, and Craig's like, well, that's interesting. Yeah, God did it. He would still say God did it. He could still move the goalposts and say that God used that hole to bring the horse into nothing. Into nothing.